My wife weaponized pop psychology to diagnose me daily until I exposed her fake expertise, shattered her control games, and reclaimed my life completely. Therapist, every single conversation becomes a diagnosis session. And guess who's always the patient with problems? My wife had this habit of throwing around psychology terms like confetti at a wedding. The moment I'd question anything she did, out came her favorite weapon. You have attachment issues. Not just once or twice, but daily. Morning coffee, attachment issues. Evening discussion about bills, attachment issues. Ask why she spent 3 hours texting her sister instead of helping with dinner. Major attachment issues. At first, I thought maybe she was on to something. Maybe I did have some deep-rooted problems I needed to work on. So I'd listen, nod, and try to be better. But then I started noticing a pattern. Every time she messed up, every time she was late, every time she forgot something important, somehow it all circled back to my supposed attachment issues. Last Tuesday was the breaking point. I came home from work and found the house exactly as I'd left it that morning. Dishes in the sink, laundry overflowing, bills scattered on the counter. She was on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely unbothered by the chaos around her. "Hey, could you help me understand something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral. We talked about splitting the household tasks, and I noticed nothing got done today. Without even looking up from her screen, she sighed dramatically. "There you go again with your attachment issues. You're being controlling and needy. This constant need for everything to be perfect is really concerning." I stood there for a moment, letting that sink in. Wanting a clean house and shared responsibility was now a psychological disorder. Expecting my partner to contribute equally was evidence of deep emotional problems. "So let me get this straight," I said, sitting down across from her. "Me asking you to do what we agreed on is attachment issues?" "It's textbook behavior," she replied, finally looking at me with that condescending smile. "You have this unhealthy need to control your environment because you're afraid of abandonment. It's actually quite common in men your age. Men my age, I'm 32. That's when something clicked. She wasn't having conversations with me. She was conducting therapy sessions where I was always the problem, and she was always the expert. Every disagreement became evidence of my psychological defects. Every reasonable request became proof of my emotional instability. I started paying closer attention to how she used these terms. Attachment issues was her go-to, but she'd also sprinkle in narcissistic tendencies, emotional immaturity, and toxic masculinity whenever she really wanted to shut down a conversation. The woman had turned our marriage into a psychology textbook where I was the case study and she was the brilliant doctor. The worst part? I'd been falling for it. For months, I'd been second-guessing myself, wondering if maybe I really was as messed up as she claimed. Maybe I was too demanding. Maybe I did have issues with control. Maybe asking my wife to contribute to our household was somehow psychologically unhealthy. But sitting there that Tuesday evening, watching her diagnose me while surrounded by the mess she'd created, I realized something important. My attachment issue wasn't with commitment or intimacy or any of the fancy terms she liked to throw around. My attachment issue was with her. I was attached to someone who used psychology as a weapon, who turned every legitimate concern into evidence of my mental instability, who had convinced me that wanting a partnership meant I was emotionally damaged. "You know what?" I said, standing up. "You're absolutely right. I do have attachment issues." Her eyes lit up with that familiar look of superiority. "I'm glad you're finally admitting it. Acknowledgement is the first step toward healing." "Yeah," I continued, walking toward the kitchen. "I'm attached to the idea that my wife should act like my partner instead of my therapist. I'm attached to the concept that marriage involves mutual respect instead of daily diagnosis sessions. And I'm definitely attached to the belief that asking someone to clean up after themselves isn't a psychological disorder." The silence that followed was deafening. For the first time in months, she didn't have a diagnosis ready. She just sat there, mouth slightly open, as if the idea that I might turn her own logic against her had never occurred to her. I started doing the dishes, and as I scrubbed each plate, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a long time: clarity. The fog of self-doubt she'd been creating with her constant psychological evaluations was finally lifting. She wasn't trying to help me become a better person. She was using psychology terms to avoid accountability, to make every problem in our marriage somehow my fault, to position herself as the wise healer and me as the broken patient who should be grateful for her insights. Well, this patient was about to get a second opinion. The real kicker came 3 days later when we went to her sister's birthday party. I thought maybe we could have a normal evening, just enjoy some family time without any psychological evaluations. I should have known better. We were sitting around the dinner table with her parents, her sister, and her brother-in-law when the conversation turned to relationships. Her sister was complaining about her husband leaving dishes in the sink, and everyone was having a good laugh about typical marriage problems. "Oh, you should see what I have to deal with," my wife chimed in, and I felt my stomach drop. "My husband has severe attachment issues. He gets upset when I don't clean the house exactly how he wants it. It's really challenging to live with someone who has such deep-seated control problems." The table went quiet. Her mother gave me a pitying look, like I was some kind of damaged goods her daughter had unfortunately gotten stuck with. Her father cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Attachment issues?" her sister asked, looking genuinely concerned. "Textbook case," my wife continued, warming up to her audience. "He has this compulsive need to control his environment. When things aren't exactly as he expects, he becomes emotionally dysregulated. It stems from childhood abandonment fears." I sat there, fork halfway to my mouth, listening to my wife diagnose me to her entire family. She was using terms like emotionally dysregulated and abandonment fears like she'd graduated from Harvard Medical School, instead of dropping out of community college after one semester. "That sounds really difficult for you," her mother said, reaching over to pat my wife's hand. "You're so patient to help him work through these issues." "Patient? Well, someone has to be the emotionally mature one in the relationship," my wife replied with a martyred sigh. "I'm basically his unpaid therapist at this point." That's when I put my fork down. "It's okay," she said, giving me that condescending smile. "I know this is hard for you to hear, but awareness is the first step." "You're right," I said, looking directly at her. "Awareness is important, so let me share some awareness with everyone." The table tensed. Her eyes widened slightly, probably realizing she'd pushed too far. "This attachment issue she's talking about? It happened because I asked her to do the dishes we'd agreed she would handle. The abandonment fears? That's because I expected her to contribute to our household like we discussed. The emotional dysregulation? That's me being frustrated when my partner turns every conversation into a therapy session where I'm always the problem." Her father leaned back in his chair, suddenly very interested in his dinner. Her mother's sympathetic expression started to shift. "And the really interesting part," I continued, "is that somehow every single issue in our marriage gets traced back to my psychological problems. When she's late, it's because I have control issues for expecting punctuality. When she doesn't follow through on commitments, it's because I have unreasonable expectations. When she spends money we don't have, it's because I'm financially anxious." "That's not fair," she interjected, but her voice had lost its confident therapeutic tone. "What's not fair," I replied calmly, "is turning your family dinner into a diagnosis session for your husband. What's not fair is using psychology terms you learned from social media to avoid taking responsibility for your actions." Her sister was staring at her plate. Her brother-in-law was suddenly fascinated by his water glass. The uncomfortable silence stretched on. "Maybe we should change the subject," her mother suggested weakly. "Great idea," I agreed. "Let's talk about something that doesn't require a psychology degree." The rest of the dinner was painfully awkward, but I noticed something interesting. Her family started asking me direct questions about work, about my hobbies, about my opinions on various topics. They were actually engaging with me as a person instead of treating me like a patient in need of their sympathy. On the drive home, she was silent for the first 10 minutes. Then the explosion came. "How could you embarrass me like that in front of my family?" "I didn't embarrass you," I said, keeping my eyes on the road. "I just refuse to let you embarrass me. They think I'm a liar now." "Are you?" She sputtered for a moment. "I was trying to help you. I was trying to make you aware of patterns that are damaging our relationship. By diagnosing me to your family over dinner. By making me sound like a psychological case study. By positioning yourself as the long-suffering wife dealing with her mentally unstable husband. I never said you were mentally unstable. You didn't have to. You painted a picture of a man with severe attachment issues, abandonment fears, and control problems. What exactly did you expect them to think?" She was quiet for a long moment. Then, predictably, she tried to flip the script. "This defensive reaction is exactly what I'm talking about. You can't handle any criticism or feedback about your behavior." I pulled into our driveway and turned off the engine. "Here's some feedback for you. A wife who respects her husband doesn't diagnose him to her family. A partner who cares about the relationship doesn't use psychology terms as weapons. And a woman who actually wants to help would suggest couples counseling instead of playing therapist. I got out of the car and walked into the house, leaving her sitting there. For the first time in our marriage, I'd set a boundary. I'd refused to accept her behavior and called it out publicly. The best part, her family had seen it too. They'd witnessed her trying to publicly shame me and watched me respond with dignity and facts instead of accepting the role of the broken husband she'd assigned me. Something had shifted and we both knew it. The next morning, I decided to do something I should have done months ago. While she was in the shower, I checked her browser history. What I found was both hilarious and infuriating. Her recent searches included signs of attachment disorder, how to deal with narcissistic husband, and toxic masculinity in relationships. Every single article was from social media influencers, lifestyle blogs, and self-help websites, not one legitimate psychology source in sight. Her most visited site was a blog called Healing Your Broken Man, run by someone whose only qualification was surviving a bad breakup. When she came downstairs for breakfast, I was ready. "So, I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," I began casually, "about my attachment issues and emotional dysregulation." Her face lit up. She thought I was finally accepting her diagnosis. "I'm glad you're taking this seriously," she said, pouring her coffee. "Self-awareness is crucial for growth." "Absolutely. That's why I was wondering, what's your background in psychology again?" She paused mid-sip. "My background? Yeah. I mean, you seem so confident in these diagnoses. I figured you must have studied psychology or counseling or something." The silence stretched uncomfortably. "I don't need a degree to recognize unhealthy patterns, right? But these are pretty specific psychological terms you're using. Attachment disorders, emotional dysregulation. That's clinical language. Where did you learn about these conditions?" Her jaw tightened. "I read. I educate myself." "That's great. What do you read? Textbooks? Professional journals? Peer-reviewed research? I don't need to justify my knowledge to you." Bingo. There it was. The deflection I'd been expecting. "I'm not asking you to justify anything. I'm genuinely curious about your sources. If I have these serious psychological issues you keep mentioning, maybe I should understand where that assessment is coming from." She stood up abruptly. "This is exactly what I mean about your controlling behavior. You're trying to invalidate my observations by questioning my qualifications. I'm asking a simple question. What are your qualifications to diagnose psychological disorders?" "I don't diagnose anything. I just point out patterns." Attachment issues isn't a pattern. It's a specific psychological condition. Emotional dysregulation is a clinical term. You told your family I had abandonment fears. Those aren't casual observations. Those are diagnoses. She was getting flustered now, her voice rising. "You're being ridiculous." "Am I? Because yesterday you sounded pretty confident telling your family about my textbook psychological problems. But now you're saying you're not qualified to make those assessments." "I never said I wasn't qualified." "So you are qualified then? What makes you qualified?" The trap was perfect. She couldn't admit she had no credentials without undermining everything she'd been saying, but she also couldn't claim qualifications she didn't have. "This is harassment," she finally said. "You're harassing me because you can't handle the truth about your issues." I laughed, actually laughed out loud. "Asking about your background is harassment now? What's the clinical term for that? Is there a disorder for deflecting simple questions? Stop it." "Stop what?" "I'm just trying to understand. If I'm going to work on these serious psychological problems you've identified, shouldn't I know if they're being assessed by someone who actually knows what they're talking about?" She stormed out of the kitchen, but not before I caught her muttering something about men and their fragile egos. Later that day, I did my own research, real research. I looked up actual information about attachment disorders from legitimate medical sources. Turns out, attachment disorders are primarily diagnosed in children and are quite rare in adults. The symptoms she'd been attributing to me didn't even match the actual clinical criteria. Emotional dysregulation is typically associated with specific mental health conditions and requires professional assessment, not something you diagnose because your husband asked you to do the dishes. Abandonment fears without a proper psychological evaluation? That's just speculation based on behavior that could have dozens of different explanations. The woman had been throwing around serious psychological terms like they were casual personality traits. She'd turned our marriage into her amateur psychology experiment with me as the unwilling subject. When she came home that evening, I was waiting with a stack of printed articles from actual psychology professionals. "I did some reading today," I said, holding up the papers. "Interesting stuff. Turns out attachment disorders are much more complex than I thought. They require extensive evaluation by licensed professionals, multiple sessions, detailed history, specific diagnostic criteria." Her face went pale. "The funny thing is, none of my behavior actually matches the clinical description, but I'm sure that's just my attachment issues talking, right?" She turned and headed for the stairs. "Oh, and honey," I called after her, "next time you want to play therapist, maybe stick to diagnosing yourself first." 2 weeks later, my parents invited us for Sunday dinner. I figured it would be a peaceful evening, but I should have known better. My wife had been unusually quiet since our conversation about her qualifications, but I could tell she was planning something. We were halfway through dinner when my dad started talking about his recent promotion at work, and how he'd had to have some difficult conversations with underperforming employees. "That must be challenging," my wife said, and I felt the familiar dread creeping in. It takes real emotional intelligence to handle those situations properly. My mother nodded. "Your father has always been good with people. Not everyone has that skill," my wife continued, glancing at me. "Some people struggle with emotional regulation when faced with conflict or criticism." Here we go. My dad looked confused. "Emotional regulation is a psychological concept," she explained, settling into her expert role. "Some people, especially men, have difficulty managing their emotional responses. They become defensive, controlling, or reactive, instead of processing feedback constructively." My mother's fork paused halfway to her mouth. She was looking between us, sensing tension. "That sounds complicated," my dad said carefully. "It is. I've been working with my husband on these issues for months. He has significant attachment problems that manifest as controlling behavior and emotional volatility." My parents exchanged glances. They'd known me for 32 years, and volatile wasn't exactly how they'd describe me. "Attachment problems?" my mother asked quietly. "Textbook case," my wife said confidently. "He struggles with abandonment fears, which create these compulsive needs to control his environment and the people around him." I set down my fork. "That's interesting. Tell them about your research." She shot me a warning look. "What?" I asked innocently. "Your research into attachment disorders. Tell my parents about your extensive study of psychology." "I don't think this is the appropriate time." "No, please," I insisted. "My parents should understand the professional expertise behind these diagnoses. Tell them about your background in mental health." The table went dead silent. My father was watching this exchange with growing understanding. "I don't need credentials to recognize patterns," she said defensively. "Credentials?" my dad asked. "What kind of credentials are we talking about? Psychological credentials?" I explained. Since she's been diagnosing me with various mental health conditions, I thought it was reasonable to ask about her qualifications. My mother's eyes widened. "Oh yes," I continued. "Attachment disorders, emotional dysregulation, abandonment issues." She's quite thorough in her assessments. "I never diagnosed anything," my wife protested. "Really? Because you just told my parents I have significant attachment problems and emotional volatility. What would you call that?" My father leaned back in his chair. He was a practical man who didn't tolerate nonsense. "So you're saying our son has psychological problems?" "I'm saying he has patterns of behavior that are concerning." "Based on what training?" my mother asked pointedly. The question hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. "I don't need training to observe." "Actually, you do," my father interrupted. "If you're going to make psychological assessments about someone, especially my son, you better have the qualifications to back it up." She was cornered now, and everyone knew it. "This is exactly what I mean," she said desperately. "Look how defensive he gets. Look how he turns everyone against me when I try to help." "Help?" My mother's voice was ice cold. "You call publicly diagnosing someone help?" "I'm not diagnosing, I'm just—" "You're just what?" my father demanded. "Making medical assessments without medical training? Telling people our son has mental health problems based on what exactly?" She looked around the table, realizing she'd lost the room completely. My parents weren't buying her act, and she had nowhere to hide. "You're all ganging up on me," she whispered. "We're asking legitimate questions," I said calmly. "The same questions I've been asking for weeks." My mother reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Honey, we've known you your entire life. If there were serious psychological issues, don't you think we'd have noticed? The validation hit harder than I expected. These people had raised me, watched me grow up, seen me through every stage of life. They knew who I really was. Of course mental health is important, my father added. But throwing around serious accusations requires serious evidence and serious qualifications. My wife stood up abruptly. I don't have to sit here and be attacked. Nobody's attacking you, I said. We're just asking you to back up your claims. She grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I'll wait in the car. After she left, the silence was deafening. Son, my father said finally, how long has this been going on? Months, and you didn't tell us. I thought maybe she was right. Maybe I did have problems. My mother shook her head sadly. The only problem here is someone using psychology as a weapon. As we drove home in tense silence, I realized something crucial had happened. My wife's tactics had backfired completely. Instead of convincing my family I was mentally unstable, she'd exposed herself as someone who made serious accusations without basis. She'd lost credibility with the people who mattered most to me, and she knew it. The drive home was the longest 20 minutes of our marriage. She stared out the window while I focused on the road, both of us knowing that something fundamental had shifted. Her little psychology game had finally backfired in front of the people whose opinions actually mattered to me. The moment we walked through the front door, she broke down. I can't believe you humiliated me like that, she sobbed. In front of your parents. I humiliated you? You told my parents I have serious psychological problems based on articles you read online. I was trying to help our marriage. I was trying to make you see. See what? That you've been playing therapist without any actual knowledge. That you've been diagnosing me with conditions you don't understand. She collapsed onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. I just wanted us to be better. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. If you wanted us to be better, you would have suggested actual counseling. You would have had conversations, instead of conducting diagnosis sessions. You wouldn't have publicly embarrassed me to both our families. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Sorry for what exactly? For the fake diagnoses? For trying to convince everyone I'm mentally unstable? For using psychology terms you learned from social media influencers? She looked up at me, mascara streaked down her cheeks. I didn't mean for it to go this far. How far did you mean for it to go? When was the plan to stop calling me psychologically damaged? I thought if you realized you had issues, you'd work on them. What issues? Be specific. What exactly is wrong with me that requires your intervention? She opened her mouth, then closed it. For the first time in months, she couldn't produce a diagnosis. You want an honest conversation? I said, sitting down across from her. Let's have one. But this time we're going to use real words instead of psychology terms you don't understand. She nodded weakly. I'm frustrated because I feel like I'm carrying more than my share of our household responsibilities. When I bring this up, instead of discussing solutions, you tell me I have control issues. I'm disappointed when you don't follow through on commitments we've made together. When I express this disappointment, you tell me I have abandonment fears. I get angry when you embarrass me in front of our families by making me sound like I'm mentally ill. When I defend myself, you call it emotional dysregulation. I see what you're saying, she said quietly. Do you? Because here's what's going to happen from now on. No more psychology terms. No more diagnoses. No more playing therapist. If you have a problem with my behavior, use your words like an adult. And if you ever diagnose me to another person again, if you ever try to convince anyone that I have psychological problems based on your internet research, this marriage is over. Her eyes widened. You don't mean that. Try me. Test that boundary and see how quickly I can pack my things. But what if I think you're actually being unreasonable about something? Then you say, I think you're being unreasonable, and we discuss it. You don't say, you have attachment issues, and shut down the conversation. She was nodding, but I could see the wheels turning. And one more thing, I added. You're going to apologize to my parents. A real apology, not one where you explain why you were actually right, but sorry for how it came across. What should I say? Try the truth, that you made inappropriate comments about my mental health without any qualifications to do so, that you embarrassed both of us, that it won't happen again. She sat there for a long moment, processing everything I'd said. What if we went to real counseling? She asked quietly. Together. If you want to go to counseling, we can go to counseling. But you don't get to play counselor anymore. You don't get to assign homework or identify my psychological problems. In counseling, we're both participants, not doctor and patient. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't a negotiation. These are the conditions for continuing this marriage. Non-negotiable conditions. She looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time. The man who had been accepting her diagnoses for months was gone. In his place was someone who had boundaries, consequences, and zero tolerance for manipulation disguised as help. "I'll call your parents tomorrow," she said finally. "Good. And one last thing, if you ever feel the urge to diagnose me again, diagnose yourself first. Ask yourself why you need to make your husband the problem, instead of addressing the actual issues between us." She flinched at that, but she didn't argue. The conversation was over. The rules had been set. For the first time in our marriage, I had taken control of the dynamic instead of letting her psychological games dictate how we communicated. She could accept these terms, or she could find herself a new patient to practice on. 3 months later, I was sitting in our living room reading when she walked in from the kitchen. She paused, looked at the pile of dishes in the sink, then looked at me. "The dishes are still there," she said. I didn't look up from my book. "Yes, they are. It's your turn to do them. Actually, it's not. Check the schedule." She walked over to the refrigerator where we'd posted our household responsibilities chart and studied it for a moment. "You're right," she said simply. "My mistake. No psychology terms. No diagnosis. No explanations about why my pointing out the schedule was evidence of control issues. Just a simple acknowledgement and correction." This was the new reality we'd created. The apology to my parents had been awkward but genuine. She'd admitted she had no qualifications to make psychological assessments, and that she'd been wrong to discuss my supposed mental health issues with family. My father had accepted it gracefully, though I could tell he'd never look at her quite the same way. More importantly, she'd followed through on our agreement. The constant stream of psychological evaluations had stopped completely. When we disagreed about something, we actually discussed it like adults instead of her immediately pathologizing my response. It wasn't always smooth. A few weeks after our big conversation, she'd slipped up during an argument about finances. "You're being really defensive about this," she'd said. "Defensive how?" I'd asked calmly. She'd caught herself before saying something about psychological patterns. "You're not listening to my point of view. Then explain your point of view without telling me what's wrong with my response to it." She'd actually done it. We'd had a real conversation about money without any amateur psychology involved. The transformation wasn't just in how she communicated. It was in how others started treating me. Her family had noticed the change immediately. At her niece's birthday party last month, her sister had actually asked my opinion about something instead of treating me like the family member with issues who needed careful handling. "You seem different," her brother-in-law had said to me quietly. "More, confident." I hadn't told him that confidence comes naturally when you're not being constantly told you're psychologically damaged. Even our friends had picked up on the shift. We'd gone to dinner with another couple, and when a disagreement came up between us, instead of her explaining my supposed psychological reasons for my position, she'd simply stated her own view and let me state mine. The other couple had treated us like equals in the conversation, instead of like a patient and his caregiver. The real test came when she started therapy herself. Real therapy with an actual licensed professional. "My therapist wants to know if you'd be interested in coming to a session," she'd said one evening. "To talk about my attachment issues?" I'd asked with a slight smile. She'd laughed, actually laughed, to talk about our communication patterns. She thinks it would be helpful to have both perspectives. "What did you tell her about me?" I told her I'd been making assumptions about your psychology without any basis for those assumptions. I told her I'd been using therapeutic language inappropriately. I told her I needed to learn how to communicate without trying to diagnose. That conversation had been a revelation. Having a real therapist facilitate our discussion had shown her just how far off base her amateur assessments had been. The therapist had pointed out that many of my responses were actually quite healthy and appropriate, which had been validating beyond measure. "I owe you an apology," she'd said on the drive home from that session, "for making you think there was something wrong with you when the problem was how I was handling our disagreements." That might have been the most important thing she'd ever said to me. Now, Sitting in our living room, watching her do the dishes without any psychological commentary about my expectations or control issues, I realized something important had happened. I'd stopped accepting being treated as the problem in our relationship and started demanding to be treated as an equal partner. The woman who used to diagnose me daily had been forced to confront her own behavior instead of constantly analyzing mine. The marriage that had become a therapy session had returned to being a partnership. My attachment issue had never been with commitment or intimacy, or any of the textbook disorders she tried to pin on me. My attachment issue had been with accepting treatment that was beneath my dignity as a human being. Sometimes the healthiest thing you can do is refuse to be anyone's amateur psychology project. Sometimes the most therapeutic response is simply saying no. She finished the dishes and walked back into the living room. "All done," she said. "Thank you," I replied, not looking up from my book. No drama, no analysis, no need to dissect the psychological implications of household chore completion. Just two adults living together with mutual respect. Imagine that. Our story has come to an end. If you've made it this far, how about subscribing to our channel? It helps us immensely. I've selected 2 other videos for you that I'm sure you'll enjoy. Feel free to click on them. I'll be waiting for you in the next story. See you soon.